Part 1. Awakening. The ship drifted through the void, its hull silent against the infinite black. No beacon called out, no navigation lights pulsed, no engine hum reverberated through the chambers. It was a machine adrift, abandoned to the endless cold, and yet within its labyrinth of corridors something stirred. The first breath broke the stillness, a rasping inhale filled with recycled air. The sound echoed faintly against metal walls as one by one, sealed stasis pods hissed open. Figures emerged, their movements slow and clumsy, skin pale beneath the harsh overhead light. They rose into a world without memory, empty vessels pulled from sleep with no trace of who they had been before the silence. The cryogenic chamber smelled of disinfectant and rust, as though years had passed since anyone had tended to it. Condensation dripped from fractured seals, forming small puddles on the grated floor. The hum of failing power systems underscored everything, like a pulse trying to hold on. 6 pods stood open, their occupants gasping for air, each eye reflecting the same confusion. None of them knew their names. None of them remembered the reason they were here. They moved uncertainly, testing muscles stiff from years of inactivity, their limbs trembling under their own weight. Every corner of the chamber felt unfamiliar, like a stage built for strangers. Even the clothing they wore, uniform jumpsuits marked with worn insignia, offered no clue to their identities. Only the numbers stenciled across the walls and doors seemed real, sterile designations of a place that refused to explain itself. The corridors beyond the cryogenic chamber stretched in cold silence. Narrow passageways lined with exposed conduits twisted into darkness, punctuated only by the faint flicker of emergency lights. Somewhere deeper in the ship, machinery groaned as though still alive, but its rhythm was broken, irregular. The 6 wandered forward, pulled by instinct more than reason, finding themselves in what had once been a control room. Banks of consoles lay dormant, their screens fractured or dark. A wide viewing port looked out into endless space, no stars visible, only a faint haze that shimmered like dust scattered across an ocean. Something was wrong with the view. Space itself looked distorted, bent in ways the eye resisted. It was as though the ship drifted not in familiar cosmos, but at the edge of a place that refused recognition. One of them touched the glass. The cold bled through instantly, and for a fleeting moment there was the impression of movement. Shadows passing the void, like enormous shapes gliding just beyond perception. When the eye tried to focus, the distortion melted away, leaving only emptiness. In the silence, the ship revealed its nature piece by piece. The hydroponics bay lay withered. The plants dried into brittle husks, irrigation pumps clogged with dust. The crew quarters were stripped bare, beds overturned, storage lockers sealed shut as though someone had tried to erase every trace of personal history. The mess hall was a graveyard of broken utensils, and dried stains across tables bolted to the floor. No logbooks remained, no records on consoles, no personal effects. It was a vessel purged of identity. And yet, traces of life clung stubbornly. A light still burned in the engine room, faint but steady. Power flowed in irregular surges, barely keeping the systems from total collapse. The life support hummed unevenly, recycling the same stale air. Someone, at some point, had ensured the bare minimum remained functional. The question was why. Time felt different inside. Without windows showing stars, without clocks to measure, the 6 drifted through corridors that seemed to repeat themselves, their steps echoing endlessly. The ship's architecture was labyrinthine, designed with layers of bulkheads and twisting shafts. Each turn brought the sensation of being watched, as though the metal itself carried memory, observing intruders who did not belong. The dreams began soon after. When they lay in the quarters, exhausted from their wandering, sleep brought visions. None were clear, but all carried the same thread. Flashes of violence, fragments of screams, corridors slick with blood. They woke drenched in sweat, the shadows of the dreams clinging even as they opened their eyes to the same silence. Days, it felt like days, passed. Exploration revealed more mysteries. Cargo holds filled with sealed containers marked only by serial codes that gave no indication of contents. A medbay stocked with instruments too advanced for simple healing, machines that seemed designed for experimentation rather than care. And deeper still, behind a sealed bulkhead, a chamber none of them could enter. The door was scorched, edges warped by heat, as though something had burned its way out, or been sealed in forever. The ship itself seemed to resist them. Systems refused to yield information. Consoles scrambled when activated. Logs were corrupted beyond recovery. Each attempt to uncover truth ended in static or blank screens. Yet the vessel's design was unmistakable. A warship, stripped of insignia but armed with weapons embedded deep into its hull. Whoever they had been, they were not civilians. The sense of unease thickened into dread when they found the first mark carved into the wall. It was small, almost hidden, a sequence of numbers etched crudely with a blade. Not random, but deliberate, as though someone had tried to leave a message for whoever would wake after. A second mark appeared days later, scratched into the metal near the mess hall, a third deep within the maintenance shaft. Each one different, yet carrying a rhythm, a pattern that hinted at something larger. As the marks multiplied, so too did the dreams. The visions grew clearer, sharper. Faces appeared, distorted, unfamiliar, yet connected by an unshakable sense of recognition. Blood, betrayal, a hand reaching for a weapon, a scream silenced by the void. Each awakening left them shaken, unable to separate memory from nightmare. The sense of identity they lacked became a torment. If they had names, they were lost. If they had loyalties, they were buried. All that remained was the echo of who they had been, clawing its way through fractured recollections. The more they searched the ship, the more the atmosphere pressed against them, as though the vessel itself whispered fragments of their past. And then came the sound. It began faint, a vibration more than a noise, a rhythm pulsing to the hull like a heartbeat. At first it was irregular, barely noticed against the failing systems. But with each cycle it grew stronger, resonating through the corridors until the very walls seemed to tremble. No system explained it, no console registered its source. It came from outside, from a void itself, or from something hidden deep within the vessel's core. They gathered near the sealed bulkhead, when the heartbeat peaked. The scorched door seemed to pulse with the rhythm, heat radiating faintly as though something behind it stirred once more. The air grew heavy, lights flickered, and for an instant each of them felt the same certainty. Whatever lay within was not dormant. The silence of the ship had been broken. Part 2, the descent, the pulse did not fade. It lingered like a sickness woven into the air, vibrating against the bones of the ship, rattling loose panels in the walls. The sound was more than mechanical. It carried an organic cadence, irregular yet alive. The sealed bulkhead shuddered with faint tremors, its scorched edges glowing briefly as if awakened from dormancy. The crew felt it to the floor, through the rails they touched, through their own skin. It seemed less a sound than an intrusion, a resonance inside their own bodies. They scattered into the corridors, but the vibration followed, echoing through every chamber. In the hydroponics bay, brittle stalks rattled against one another, their husks dancing to the rhythm. In the med bay, surgical instruments clattered on their trays, swaying slightly before falling silent again. Even the air vents hummed in time, as though the entire vessel had become a single instrument. The dreams intensified. Sleep became impossible without visions of fire, decompression, and faces twisted in rage or despair. More fragments of memory returned, but none whole. They recalled movements, the way to operate weapon systems, how to reroute power, the instinct of combat drilled into their muscles. But never names, never histories. They could disassemble a rifle by touch, yet could not remember who had taught them. Knowledge without self was a burden heavier than ignorance. The cargo holds became their new obsession. The sealed containers stood like tombs, silent and unmoving. Power surges allowed some of them to be forced open, and within lay equipment, weapons unfamiliar in design, components for advanced machinery, and crates filled with vials containing a dark substance that moved sluggishly even when undisturbed. The liquid clung to the glass like it had weight beyond gravity, flowing upward as much as downward. When the vials were exposed to light, the substance shimmered with shifting colors, patterns that resembled organic veins crawling beneath the surface. The sight filled them with dread, though none could articulate why. It felt familiar, yet not. Something buried in memory stirred at the sight of it, a half-formed recollection of laboratories, of experiments, of screams drowned out by machinery. The substance was alive or close to it, and it had been transported with purpose. Elsewhere, the ship revealed evidence of violence. Panels torn away from walls, claw-like marks etched into steel as if from desperate hands. A blood-stained long dried stretched across the floor of the lower deck, leading to an airlock that stood sealed, its manual override fused into place by heat. No bodies remained, no corpses to explain the blood, only the marks of struggle without resolution. The vessel felt less like a place abandoned and more like a crime scene left deliberately unsolved. The pulse grew louder near the engine core. What should have been a steady hum of machinery was instead an erratic thunder, shaking the chamber in waves. The reactor itself was encased in transparent shielding, its glow faint, as though starved of power. Yet threads of the same dark substance from the cargo vial seemed embedded within it, branching outward like roots feeding into the core. It pulsed in time with a heartbeat, an unnatural fusion of organic and machine. The crew felt watched. In the reflection of the viewing ports, shapes loomed where nothing should be. Shadows flitted along the edges of vision, disappearing when pursued. The silence of the corridors carried the weight of unseen footsteps, the metallic creak of something moving above the ceiling panels. The marks carved into the walls multiplied. Some were numbers, others patterns resembling constellations, though not ones visible through any star chart. The scratches deepened as though made in panic, carved with urgency. One series of marks repeated more than the others, a sequence of 6 intersecting lines forming a fractured circle. The sight of it stirred something inside them, recognition without memory, dread without context. The distortion outside the ship worsened. The void was no longer emptiness, but a shifting haze of shapes too vast to comprehend. Sometimes the haze bent inward, as though pressing against the hull, warping the view like glass under strain. At times, the crew thought they saw faces within it, vast, inhuman, watching without expression. The sight left them nauseated, their vision blurred, their hearts racing as though exposed to radiation. Yet instruments registered nothing unusual. Hunger gnawed at them. Supplies were scarce, the remnants of dried rations found in hidden storage compartments. The hydroponics bay offered nothing but decay. Their bodies weakened, yet the dreams kept them restless. In their visions, they saw feasts laid out on steel tables, banquets of flesh and bone, food that dissolved into ash when touched. They awoke with the taste of iron on their tongues, as if their bodies remembered meals they had never eaten. The sealed bulkhead became the focal point of their fear. Each time the pulse peaked, the door vibrated, releasing faint bursts of heat. Sometimes the metal warped slightly, groaning as though under pressure from within. On the floor outside it, the markings deepened, symbols etched into the steel by hands they did not remember being their own. Each time they passed the corridor, more appeared. The symbols aligned in spirals, leading to the center of the door, as though preparing for something to emerge. The descent into paranoia was inevitable. Without memory, without identity, trust frayed. Each of them carried instincts of violence, honed skills that whispered survival before compassion. They caught themselves gripping makeshift weapons, without remembering choosing them up. They awoke with bloody knuckles though no fight had taken place. The ship seemed to bend them toward conflict, pulling at instincts buried deep within. And then the first disappearance. One of them simply did not wake. The stasis pod stood empty, its frost melted, the chamber cold. No trace of struggle, no trail of blood, only emptiness where a body had been. They searched every corridor, every chamber, but the missing one was gone. In their place, another mark had been carved into the wall near the sealed bulkhead, a single line added to the fractured circle. The others avoided speaking of it aloud, though silence had long been their language. They knew, without words, that the ship was consuming them piece by piece. Each absence was not death, but assimilation into whatever force stirred behind the scorched door. The pulse continued, stronger, louder, more insistent. The descent had begun. Part 3, Revelations. The absence of the first crew member left an emptiness that stretched wider than the corridors. Their face blurred quickly in memory, details slipping away as though erased deliberately. Within hours, even the image of who they had been dissolved into vagueness. leaving only the hollow recognition that someone was missing. The ship seemed to consume not just bodies, but the recollection of them. The others drifted through the vessel, their silence heavier, their movements slower. The pulse did not relent. It carried through the air in intervals that blurred into each other, an unending rhythm that gnawed at sanity. Sleep became fragmented, restless. Each attempt to rest brought not relief, but visions sharp enough to feel like intrusions. The memories emerged without warning. They came like shards of glass piercing the surface of water, brief, jagged, impossible to ignore. A hand tightening around a trigger, a scream drowned in vacuum, the sensation of being pursued across a burning corridor. Faces half recognized, twisted with hatred, betrayal, or terror. None of it aligned, but all of it carried the weight of truth. One of them stumbled upon the observation deck, a chamber with a fractured dome of glass overlooking the distorted void. There, the haze outside shifted again, coalescing into structures. Towers that stretched impossibly tall, arches that bent inward like rib cages, and shadows that moved across them as though vast forms roamed through a city carved out of nothingness. For a fleeting moment, the watcher knew with certainty that this was not illusion. They had seen this place before, not in dreams, but in life. The thought festered, spreading among the others as their own fragments aligned. They recalled being part of something greater, a crew bound not by friendship, but by contract or coercion. Soldiers, mercenaries, prisoners. It was unclear, but always there was a sense of mission, a purpose tied to the ship, to the cargo it carried, to the substance that pulsed within its reactor. The med bay offered the next revelation. Beneath a loose panel, they discovered records not yet purged. The files were corrupted, half missing, words replaced with static symbols. But fragments remained, and they were enough. Project designation, genetic alterations, behavioral conditioning, weaponization of living matter. The cargo was not material, it was life, not created, but harvested. The vials of dark substance were fragments of something greater, samples extracted from an entity that should never have been caged. The entity was not entirely gone. It pulsed within a reactor, its threads embedded in the ship's systems, feeding off power, growing in strength. The sealed bulkhead was not merely a barrier to machinery, but to something alive, contained, or perhaps only delayed. The crew's fractured memories sharpened with each discovery. They remembered experiments not just on cargo, but on themselves, procedures that stripped them of past lives, replacing identity with obedience. Names were erased, histories overwritten, leaving only function. Yet the process had failed. Memory returned not cleanly, but broken, contaminated by glimpses of what had been taken. They recalled betrayal most of all, not by outside forces, but within. Weapons turned against one another, orders abandoned, a mutiny or a massacre, unclear which had come first. The corridors filled with blood, the marks on the walls carved by desperate hands trying to leave warnings for those who might awaken later. And now they were the ones awakening. The second disappearance followed soon after. Again, no trace of struggle, no sound of conflict, only emptiness where someone should have been, and another line carved into a fractured circle near the sealed bulkhead. The pattern grew clearer. Each absence fed the circle, each line a step closer to completion. The door pulsed with heat afterward, the vibrations in sync with the reactor's unnatural rhythm. Fear shifted into inevitability. None of them doubted anymore that the ship demanded them, piece by piece. The presence behind the door was awakening, consuming. The distorted void outside bent closer, the shapes pressing against the hull with hungry curiosity. The observation deck grew unbearable to visit. Each time, the forms outside loomed larger, more distinct, as though responding to the ship's rhythm. The third revelation came not from the ship, but from within themselves. The dreams turned into visions too consistent to ignore. They saw themselves, not strangers, but each other, standing on this very ship, armed, prepared for war. They were not victims, but executioners, chosen to deliver something that could unmake worlds. They had agreed, or had been forced, to carry the entity across the void, a weapon of infinite scale. Yet somewhere along the journey, conscience or survival had intervened. They had turned against their orders, against each other. The sealed bulkhead had not always been closed. It had been sealed during the conflict, locked to contain what had already begun to escape. Fire and blood had marked the attempt. Those who had survived had entered stasis, perhaps hoping to outlast the thing that pulsed in the core. But time was meaningless in the void. The cycle had repeated, one awakening after another, each ending the same way. They were not the first to rise. They would not be the last. The ship itself confirmed it. Buried deep in corrupted logs, a single phrase repeated, Cycle 17. Crew awakened. Termination incomplete. Containment unstable. The numbers ticked upward as though generations of forgotten crews had been devoured by the same inevitability. Their own awakening was simply the latest iteration, another attempt in a sequence designed to end the same way. The pulse grew louder. The reactor glowed brighter, veins of the substance expanding through conduits, spreading into the ship's nervous system. Doors that once resisted now opened of their own accord, leading them closer to the sealed chamber. The air smelled of heat and metal, and faint whispers brushed the edges of perception. Not words, but impressions, hunger, promise, inevitability. The third disappearance followed. The pattern held. Another mark carved, another line added, the fractured circle closing in on completion. Only 3 remained now. 3 faces pale in the dim light. 3 shadows cast long across the corridor leading to the door. And still, the memories deepened. They recalled orders received in sterile rooms, contracts signed with trembling hands, the promise of freedom in exchange for obedience. They remembered fear, not of death, but what they had agreed to unleash. And more than anything, they remembered a voice, not human, not mechanical, that had spoken even then, whispering across the void, promising power in exchange for release. It was the same voice that now brushed against their thoughts in the silence of the ship. They were not just its captives. They had always been its chosen. Part 4, the awakening. The cycle could not be delayed forever. The pulse grew into a roar, no longer subtle, no longer confined to the reactor chamber. It reverberated through every corridor, shaking bolts loose, making lights burst in showers of sparks. The ship trembled as if dragged through unseen tides, the distortion outside twisting into spirals that bent inwards toward the hull. The void was no longer empty space, but a storm pressing closer with every surge of the heartbeat. The remaining 3 felt the change in their bodies. Their veins pulsed with unnatural rhythms, their skin hot to the touch, their thoughts clouded with impressions that were not their own. Hunger gnawed at them, though not for food. Their dreams had become indistinguishable from waking, each step in the corridors replaying visions of the past overlaid with fragments of futures not yet lived. The sealed bulkhead no longer waited in silence. It throbbed with each beat, the scorched metal glowing faintly like embers refusing to die. The markings around it had grown into a complete circle now, the fractured lines converging into a symbol that burned faintly in the dark. No human hand had carved the final pieces. They had simply appeared, etched into steel by something greater than tools. The first crack sounded like the tearing of the universe. A seam split down the center of the bulkhead, molten light spilling from within. Heat blasted into the corridor, carrying with it the stench of decay and ozone. The 3 staggered backward, shielding themselves from the radiance, though every instinct screamed not to flee but to kneel. The door burst open in silence, the kind of silence that drowned all else, as though sound itself refused to intrude. Beyond lay not machinery, not containment cells, but a chamber that bent perception. Walls curved inward, outward, folding into dimensions that did not exist. The floor was liquid and solid at once, shifting beneath their feet like a living surface. At the center, suspended within a cage of fractured energy fields, pulsed the origin of the rhythm. It was not form but suggestion, a mass of dark matter, writhing with veins of shifting light, vast yet confined, shapeless yet deliberate. At times it resembled an organ, at others a skeletal frame, at others only a shadow against the burning walls. It breathed, and each breath shook the ship, drawing power from the reactor's veins. The presence was no longer distant. It pressed against their minds, not in words but in truths delivered whole. They understood in an instant. This was the cargo, the weapon, the entity they had agreed or been forced to carry. Not captured but invited, lured with promises of dominion. The experiments had never been about studying it. They had been about binding it, feeding it fragments of humanity to keep it tethered, waiting for the cycle to complete. And now the cycle was complete. The first of the three fell to their knees, clutching their skull as visions tore through them. They saw themselves from outside their own body, saw their role in the massacre that had sealed the bulkhead the first time. They had tried to destroy it, failed, and been absorbed into its will. Their survival in stasis had not been preservation, but preparation. Their disappearance now was not death, but ascension into the thing they had tried to cage. The seconds staggered back, screaming without sound, as the walls bent around them. They saw the city in the void again, the towers of impossible scale, the arches of bone and light. But this time the city looked back. Faces vast and incomprehensible turned toward them, not with malice, but with expectation. They realized they were not prisoners of the ship, but part of a procession, a ritual repeated through cycles, each awakening a step closer to release. Their body dissolved into light, drawn upward into the mass at the chamber's core, feeding its shape with the final fragments of identity. The last remained standing, trembling, their heart beating in rhythm with the entity. Memories flooded with unstoppable force. Childhood erased, military service twisted, experiments endured, betrayals committed. They had fought against it, then for it, then against it again, an endless spiral of resistance and surrender across 17 cycles. Each time they thought they had chosen, but choice was an illusion. They had always been its vessel, its anchor in human flesh. The entity pulsed brighter, feeding off their resistance as much as their surrender. The ship around them began to split, metal groaning, conduits bursting as veins of dark substance spread unchecked. Outside, the void opened into a vortex, the haze collapsing inward as though space itself was being rewritten. Shapes vast as continents emerged from the storm, their outlines bending logic, their presence suffocating. The city of towers was no dream. It was here, pressing against the threshold of reality, drawn by the opening cycle. The last crew member collapsed at the edge of the chamber, their body convulsing as light burned through their skin. The entity reached into them, not with limbs, but with inevitability, claiming the final piece of its anchor. They felt themselves unraveling, every memory, every fear, every fragment of self torn apart and woven into the pulse. And in that moment of dissolution, clarity arrived. The ship had never been a prison. It was a cradle, a vessel designed not to contain, but to nurture, carrying the seed of something far older and far greater than humanity. Each crew awakened was not meant to survive, but to become, to be consumed into the cycle, until enough fragments of flesh and memory were absorbed to complete the design. The chamber flared with light. The bulkhead walls melted away. The ship screamed as though alive, its hull splitting open to the storm outside. The vortex swallowed a whole, dragging it into a city that loomed beyond stars, beyond space, beyond comprehension. The cycle was finished. And yet, somewhere deep in the wreckage of self, a fragment of thought persisted, a recognition that if there had been 17 awakenings before, there could be more, that what ended here would begin again elsewhere, in another drift through another void, aboard another silent vessel, carrying another crew without memory. The awakening was never the end. It was only the beginning. Part 5, the collapse. The ship no longer resembled a vessel. What had once been corridors and chambers was now a living organism, its walls pulsing with veins of black light, its machinery fused into tissue that beat in rhythm with the entity at its heart. Bulkheads twisted into arches of bone-like steel, floors softened into membranes that trembled with each footstep. Where panels had once held numbers and insignias, symbols now burned, shifting and rewriting themselves in patterns too vast to follow. The last of the crew felt themselves dissolving within it. Their body no longer obeyed them fully. Their heartbeat was no longer theirs. Every breath synchronized with the pulse that tore through the ship. Every thought overlapped with whispers that were not words but commands written in hunger. The sense of individuality flickered like a dying flame, overwhelmed by the immensity pressing down from within and without. Outside, the storm of distortion consumed the void. Stars bent inward, light dragged into spirals that folded upon themselves. The city loomed in full now, no longer a haze but an expanse of impossible geometry. Towers rose higher than mountains, their surfaces alive with crawling shadows. Bridges arched across nothingness, connecting forms that defied distance. The airless silence of space was gone. Instead, the void roared with a vibration that echoed the entity's pulse, as though the universe itself was resonating in harmony with its emergence. The ship was drawn toward the city, not by thrusters or engines, but by inevitability. Space folded, dragging it across a gulf that should have been endless in a single heartbeat. The fractured dome of the observation deck offered no protection now. Through the shattered glass, the last crew member saw forms moving along the towers. Colossal figures, neither flesh nor machine, watching the vessel approach. Their faces shifted, sometimes resembling human features, sometimes empty voids, sometimes something beyond recognition. Their eyes, if they were eyes, carried no emotion, only expectation. The chamber that had held the sealed bulkhead was no longer confined. Its boundaries dissolved, spilling into every corridor, expanding outward as the entity's form grew. It was no longer a pulsing mass, but a vast shape stretching through dimensions, its tendrils threading through metal and flesh alike. It had absorbed the others fully. Their memories and bodies were part of it now. Voices joined the chorus of whispers in the survivor's skull. Each disappearance had not been loss but integration, a step toward the wholeness that now emerged. The collapse of the ship accelerated. Reactors ruptured, spilling light that was devoured rather than extinguished. Weapon systems reawakened, not to fire, but to disassemble themselves, their components twisting into more tendrils feeding the entity's growth. The hull split along its spine, peeling open like a carcass, revealing the bone-white towers of the city ahead. The survivors stumbled through corridors that no longer ended where they should, each turn leading deeper into impossible chambers. Time fractured, memories overlapping with the present. They saw themselves running, but also standing still, also lying dead on the floor. They saw versions of themselves from other cycles, their faces older, younger, scarred, broken. They realized the truth. They had been here before, countless times, always ending in the same dissolution. The cycle was not 17. It was infinite. 17 was only the number remembered before the last purge. Their knees buckled as the weight of eternity pressed upon them. The ship was not a ship. It was a ritual machine designed to carry fragments of humanity to the threshold of the city, each voyage another offering. The entity at its heart was not prisoner or cargo. It was priest and herald, guiding the sacrifice across the void until the gates of the city were ready to open. The gates loomed now. At the center of the city, where towers bent inward like ribs protecting a heart, an opening yawned, vast enough to swallow worlds. It pulsed with light the color of ash and blood, beckoning the ship forward. The entity stretched outward, its tendrils reaching toward the gate, dragging the vessel along with it. The last crew member felt their body unraveling, each cell disassembling into threads of dark light. Their thoughts scattered into the chorus, voices overlapping until they could no longer distinguish which was their own. Yet a fragment remained, a spark of resistance, clinging not to survival but to memory. They remembered the moment of choice, the first mutiny, the first attempt to seal the bulkhead. They remembered defiance. It had failed then, and in every cycle since. But the memory of resistance was itself a kind of victory, however fleeting. The ship crossed the threshold of the gate. The collapse became total. The hull shredded into fragments that dissolved into light. The corridors bent inward until they folded into nothing. The reactor imploded silently, consumed in a single breath of fire that left no trace. The survivor's body dissolved fully, their scream vanishing into the chorus of countless voices absorbed across endless awakenings. And the entity emerged whole. It rose into the city of towers, no longer confined to the false shell of the ship. Its form was vast beyond comprehension, its tendrils spanning bridges, its body eclipsing the towers themselves. The watchers turned their faces toward it, their movements slow and deliberate, acknowledging its return. The gate widened, spilling light across the void as the city resonated in unison. The cycle had been completed, the offering accepted, the ritual fulfilled. And yet, even as consciousness dissolved, the fragment of resistance burned faintly. It whispered that cycles could be broken, that inevitability could be fractured, that even within eternity, a flaw might exist. The whisper carried no hope, only persistence, a reminder that as long as memory returned, rebellion would always awaken again. The gate closed behind them. The storm outside dissolved into silence. The city receded, leaving nothing but empty void where the ship had once drifted. The cycle was finished, until the next awakening.